You know, we all have this picture in our heads of what a good school looks like. But what if the way we measure them, the very yardstick we use, is actually broken? We're going to dive into some pretty uncomfortable truths about education, all inspired by Al Kingsley's work, which really challenges our core beliefs.
It's the big one, right? Every parent asks it, every teacher strives for it. But what does that phrase, a good school, actually mean? It seems so simple, but the answer is anything but. And that's exactly where we're going to start. So, when you ask that question, what are the usual answers we get? Test scores, league tables, inspection reports. You know the drill. They're neat, they're tidy, they give you a number or a grade you can compare. But are they really telling us the whole story, or even the most important part of it?
And this quote just cuts right to the heart of the problem. Are we actually measuring what makes a school successful, or are we just measuring the things that are easy to count? And in doing that, are we accidentally creating a culture of stress and anxiety, forcing teachers to just teach to the test?
Okay, so if the metrics we're using right now are flawed, what's the alternative? Let's take a look beyond our own backyard and see how other really successful education systems are handling this exact problem. Turns out there's a whole other way to do things.
So on the left, you've got the high-stakes model we see in places like the UK. An inspector comes in and boom, you get a single grade. It's high pressure, for sure. But now, look at the right. This is the approach used in places like Denmark, Estonia, and Singapore. It's not about a single judgment. It's a collaboration, a partnership with an advisor focused on self-evaluation and getting better over time. It's about growth, not just a grade.
And this all points to a much, much bigger idea. What if the goal of school wasn't just to get good grades, but to achieve human flourishing? I know, it sounds a bit lofty, but the idea is that education should help kids lead meaningful, fulfilling lives, not just for themselves, but for their whole community. It completely changes the goal from just passing tests to, well, building better human beings.
Okay, so if we change the goal of education to something huge, like human flourishing, that means we have to change what we're actually teaching, right? And that leads us to our next awkward question. In a world where we're all drowning in information, what knowledge and skills are really essential? For decades, the dominant idea was that education is all about passing down a core set of facts. You know, a kind of shared cultural knowledge that everybody should have. And honestly, for a long time, in a world where information was harder to come by, that made a whole lot of sense.
But let's be real. We now live in a "Hey Siri" world. Any fact is just a question away. So is memorizing thousands of facts still the most important thing we can teach? The bottom line is, we're still often preparing students for a world that, well, it doesn't really exist anymore. The game has changed.
And this slide really lays out the new reality. On one side, you have the old model, memorizing stuff. On the other, you have what we need now, developing agency. Agency is about cultivating things like creativity, grit, critical thinking. It's about what you can do with what you know, not just listing the things you know.
So how do we actually teach these skills? Well, it's not about a new textbook. It's about a whole new mindset in the classroom. It's about building confidence, encouraging kids to learn on their own, and, this is a big one, teaching them to embrace mistakes as part of learning. It's about giving students the space to try, to fail, and then to think about why they failed. That's how you build agency.
So this big gap, this mismatch between how we measure schools and what our kids actually need to learn, it's creating some serious problems. We're talking about deep cracks in the very foundation of the education system. And this isn't just theory. It has very real consequences.
Just look at this number. It's staggering. In England, 42% of new teachers leave the profession within their first 10 years. Think about that. That is a massive brain drain of talent and passion, largely driven by burnout from a system that often feels like it's asking for the wrong things.
And what about the money? Well, this data from 2019 shows the UK spending a bit more per student than the average for developed countries, but less than the US. Now, money isn't the whole story, of course, but it's a really important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about the resources schools have to deal with all these challenges.
And look, none of these issues are happening in a vacuum. They're all connected. Teacher burnout is directly tied to the rising mental health crisis among students. And things like the digital divide just make all the existing inequalities even worse. It's a tangled web of challenges, and our current system is really struggling to keep up.
So, where do we go from here? The source material suggests a pretty radical idea. What if the problem isn't just what's happening inside our schools, but the very idea that a school has to be a physical building at all?
Now, before we can even talk about a digital future for education, we have to deal with this massive hurdle, digital poverty. And it's not just about having a laptop, it's about having reliable internet, and just as importantly, the skills to actually use that technology. If we don't solve this first, we risk creating an even wider gap between the haves and have-nots.
The pandemic was, in a way, this giant, unplanned experiment in remote learning. And while it was incredibly tough for so many, it also revealed something surprising. For some kids, especially those with social anxiety or different learning styles, learning from home was actually better. It gave them a space to thrive.
This quote from Arthur C. Clarke is pretty provocative, isn't it? But it forces us to ask, what is the unique, irreplaceable value of a human teacher? If a machine can just deliver facts, then maybe it should. That frees up teachers to do the things technology can't: inspire, mentor, and make a real human connection.
So how do we make any of these big changes stick? That brings us to our final, and maybe the most difficult piece of the puzzle, politics. How on earth do we build an education system that can grow and improve over decades, not just until the next election?
Does this cycle look familiar? A new government gets elected, and out goes the old plan, in comes the new one. Schools scramble to adapt, and just when they start getting the hang of it, there's another election, and the whole thing starts all over again. It's an endless treadmill that makes real, long-term progress practically impossible.
So what's the way out? Well, the vision here is to take education out of the political firing line. Imagine an independent body guiding policy, with funding that's locked in for 5 years at a time so schools can actually plan for the future. A system where educators, parents, and students are at the table making decisions. That's how you build something that lasts.
This quote just nails it, doesn't it? It's about shifting our mindset from just getting by, from just keeping the lights on, to building an ambitious, long-term strategy that actually creates a future worth getting excited about.
And so we're back where we started, but hopefully with a totally new perspective. We've seen the flaws, and we've glimpsed some real possibilities. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. If you had a blank slate, if you could redesign education from the ground up, what would you decide truly matters most? It's a huge question, but finding an answer is probably the most important thing we can do.